I hope everybody's having a good morning. Um, I'm going to be discussing the National Historic Preservation Act um, and the requirements related to it for historic properties. It's going to be primarily about the National Historic Preservation Act, but we have two methods of compliance, or I shouldn't say two methods of compliance. We have a programmatic agreement that we've established with the SHPO and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in Washington that gives us some alternate evaluation processes for it. And Section 106 applies to all federal agencies and all federally funded or licensed projects, which will include the recreational trails program. To begin with 106, I think the most important thing is to start with the terminology that is used, because frequently people refer to it as cultural resources. They're generally referred to as historic sites, but normally most people tend to differentiate between archaeological sites and historic sites simply because of the different professionals that are involved. But a historic site or a cultural resource, any historic site is a cultural resource. And the types of sites are listed in the evaluation criteria for the National Register of Historic Places. They're buildings, objects, structures, landscapes, districts, or archaeological sites. To be called historic only requires them to be of 50 years of age or older. There is a little bit of leeway there in that if you have something that is of extraordinary significance or of extraordinary importance, you may know that well before the 50 years are up. That was especially true back when we were dealing with World War II resources. Most of those we knew were going to be significant prior to them reaching 50 years of age, and also in Florida, the space program related resources. And a cultural resources is simply, in the way we're going to be using it today, is simply kind of a synonym for historic resources. There gets to be a little bit more subtlety when you deal with Native American resources or Native sites that Native Americans may have attaching importance to. Now, the difference between a cultural resource and a historic property is probably something that is important for you to know. And one of the things I want to distinguish straight out is that the cultural or historic resource is any prehistoric, that the same listing I just gave you, district, site, building, structure, object, that is 50 years of age or older, which means that a trail in an existing trail in a park could itself be an element of a historic property. We ran into that in Miami, where there was a specifically designed trail or pathway in a park from the 1920s. And so the actual layout of that trail was a historic feature of that property. Now, a historic property, and this is the important part, a historic property is any cultural resource that has been determined significant. And for the purposes of Section 106 in the National Historic Preservation Act, significance means that it is either eligible for inclusion or it is already included in the National Register of Historic Places, or the NRHP. Notice that little purple reference down at the bottom, because a lot of what we do is going to be tied, or a lot of what you do is going to be tied to the regulations, the implementing regulations of the National Historic Preservation Act. So we've already taken care of the most important definitions at the get-go. Other definitions may come up as we go through, but generally this is what we're going to be covering in this presentation. Those definitions and explanations I just gave, the legal authorities, the general Section 106 process, the National Register criteria, our section, the FDEP Section 106 process, because as I said, we have a programmatic agreement that has certain stipulations that give us a little bit of flexibility in the detail to which we must go to identify, evaluate, and look at effects to historic properties with. And then some final notes on qualifications and the important role of the public plays in consulting parties as they're defined in Section 106. In the determinations both of the significance and importance of the resources, as well as in weighing the effects that a project may have on a particular historic property. The legal authority, and this is the most important one for our purposes today, are the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed by Congress to ensure that the impacts of growth and development triggered by federal projects that are carried out by federal agencies or approved by federal agencies, that the effects of those projects on the historic resources are taken into account, because frequently federal aid projects beginning in the 60s started to destroy or damage a large number of historic properties. And so the federal government, enough voters complained to their representatives that eventually that they got around to passing a National Historic Preservation Act. There were earlier preservation acts going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt's American Antiquities Act. The second part of that is our programmatic agreement. It was originally between FHWA, the Advisory Council, the Florida Division on Historic Resources, the DHR, as you all are probably know them best. The director of the DHR serves as the State Historic Preservation Officer, and then FDOT, of course. We wrote it and also signed it. And it's for the implementation of the Federal Aid Highway Program in Florida, which is inclusive of the Recreational Trails Program, because it's a federal aid project through the FHWA. The Section 106 PA is what we call that agreement for short, and the Section 106 PA outlines the FDOT's process for compliance. And it's all well within the confines of the 106 process. And as a note, along with the NEPA assignment, the FHWA is no longer a participant in that 106 programmatic agreement document, except in rare instances where the Native American tribe may request government-to-government consultation with them. I don't foresee that happening much on a trail project, but I don't want to leave it out, because if I leave it out, it'll happen. That's my experience. And the Section 106 is the actual driver behind our Section 106 process, and that process is defined in 36 CFR Part 800, the 36 Code of Federal Regulations Part 800, various sections in them, and it sets out a 4-step process, which we'll go into more detail in with the succeeding slides. But there's the initiation of the Section 106 process, then the identification of the historic properties, then the determination of adverse effect. Are historic properties going to be applying the criteria of adverse effect? Are they going to be adversely affected? And then the resolution of adverse effects. And that's one we're hoping that we don't run into much on trail projects, because once we get into adverse effects, then we won't be able to pursue a Type 2, or Type 1 CE rather, excuse me, a Type 1 CE. In initiating the Section 106 process, there are a couple of activities, and each one of these steps has an exit point. You'll see noted on each of these slides that are on the steps. The establishing an undertaking is simply determining, for federal undertakings, it's simply determining whether or not there's federal funding or federal approvals that are going to be required for the project. If that is true, then it's a federal undertaking. Works the same way for state undertakings. If the project involves an agency of the executive branch of the state government as a funding source or as an approving agent, then that triggers the state historic preservation law, which is Chapter 267 of the Florida statutes. It requires coordinating it with other reviews as appropriate. Most commonly for us, for these projects anyway, that's going to be coordinating it with the NEPA review. And then initiate consultation. Every 106 protected property, or every property that may be protected by 106, may have parties that are interested in the undertaking or in the effects of the undertaking on the historic property. And those are the consulting parties. They can include anybody, the general public, business that's near the project or alongside the project, or an agency that may have property that they have control over alongside the project, or the property goes through. So that's part of identifying those parties is part of the initiation of the consultation. The SHPO is always a consulting party unless it's a project on tribal lands, which should not occur with the Rec Trails program. And creating a public involvement plan is part of initiating consultation. And then at that point, you notify any of the parties that you may believe have an interest in the project to inform them that the project is occurring. The most appropriate being the State Historic Preservation Act. The State Historic Preservation Officer, excuse me. The exit point on the step one is that you have no undertaking. So, for example, if there was no federal involvement in the project at all for permits or for funding, then if it was a recreational trail we were funding with state funds only, which isn't really part of this program, but it's the best example I can give you at the time, you would have no federal undertaking. And the other exit point is that the project that you are planning, the project you have planned out, has no potential to cause effects to historic properties. And when making that determination, it's important to note that you have to assume that such properties may be present in the area of the project. And that determination is going to be based heavily on the types of activities that are associated with the project. Because there are certain things that if it's happening right on a historic resource, it's probably going to have the potential to cause effects. And you may not know at this time because you have yet to do an identification of the historic properties involved. The second step begins with the identification of historic properties, begins with determining the area of potential effect, and the identification of the historic properties that are within that area of potential effect. The area of potential effect is the area within which the undertaking may cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties, if any exist. And as I said before, the regulations state an assumption that they do exist there, but you may not know what kind they are, and different kinds of properties are sensitive to different kinds of effects. It's also influenced by the scale and nature of the undertaking, and may be different for different kinds of effects. It should include all the project alternatives that you're going to be weighing, all locations that may be subject to ground disturbing activity, because obviously archaeological resources would be very sensitive to ground disturbing activity, any staging or storage area for materials or equipment, lay down yards or anything like that, all locations from which elements of the proposed undertaking may be visible or audible. Because the criteria of effect, or when you're looking to see what may be affected, you have to include both direct effects, indirect effects, and effects which may be cumulative or may be removed in time or distance to the project, ones that are easily discernible. For example, if we, the DOT, were to widen a 2-lane road to a 4-lane road, up to the edge of a 2-lane historic bridge, it would be a safe assumption to say that eventually we're going to have to widen that 2-lane bridge. So we would have to include that as part of our area of potential effect. Then you go on to the second part, and this part is where sometimes you can combine findings or steps, and these are the two most common. This is the point at which most joining of determinations may occur, or steps may occur, and that's in the identification of historic properties. If you identify historic resources, say, or if we identify historic resources and we determine that they're not eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and we determine that in consultation with the SHPO and the other appropriate consulting parties, then everybody's agreed that there are no historic properties present, then you'd certainly have no potential. There will be no historic properties affected. If there are none in existence in the APE for the project, then you won't be affecting any. And that's sort of the exit point for this step, and it takes you out of the 106 process before you get into whether or not, before you apply the criteria of adverse effect, which is the third step in the process. And that's where you identify eligibility. Now, at this point, there's going to be some slides that are going to be very busy. I kind of apologize for that, but it's just the nature of the beast. This is the National Register criteria for evaluation. I don't expect you to remember them. One of the reasons there's some references on some of these slides is because I knew the slides would be retained for your future review. So there's references on the slides where to find these information. Most of this information can be found either in the regulations, which are referenced in the PD&E chapter, chapter 8 of the part 2, or in the programmatic agreement. All of those of which are also linked to our web page, our office web page. The criteria of evaluation simply means that there's 4 criteria of significance, or types of association, and there's 7 aspects of integrity, and they're listed on this slide along with the 4 criteria. Normally, archaeological sites are evaluated by archaeologists under criterion D. The ones that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. But occasionally when those kinds of sites are sent to the tribes, along with information, any of the tribes that have cultural or historic association with Florida, they may have a different opinion in that matter. So with archaeological sites, a lot of times consultations with the tribes are very, very important. But once again, if nothing meets these criteria or has no integrity or does not meet the requirements of integrity, then it will not be eligible, and you won't have to consider the project under 106 past that point. You just record the basis on which the determination is made, along with the Cultural Resources Assessment Survey we conducted to identify the historic resources and evaluate them, the properties, and go from there. Now, assessing adverse effects. This is something that once you get to, you want to end with no historic properties adversely affected. That's kind of the main intent of the law. Because once you get to a finding of adverse effect, then we won't be doing a type 1 CE anymore. Now, there's a couple of ways this can be arrived at. You can identify a property that's eligible for the National Register in the area of potential effects, and we may even have to acquire or demolish that property in the design that we have outlined for the project. But we may identify, once we determine that we have a significant historic property there, we may determine that we can avoid it and not damage it. And that way, that's one way to avoid not having an adverse effect. You have to consult with the SHPO on these determinations along with the other consulting parties. One of the key points of the Section 106 process, and if we go back to the flow chart that I provided earlier, you'll see down the left-hand side coordination and our consultation. Consultation is involved throughout the Section 106 process with the consulting parties and with the public as appropriate. And the exit point for this is no historic properties adversely affected. Now, this photograph was chosen by Matt Marino, who originally developed this particular presentation, or the outlines for this particular presentation. And I retained this structure, even though I know very little about it, because it would be obviously this particular property obviously could be easily affected by visual impacts that could have an adverse effect. But that whole one side of the house being glass, that means the view out of it, if not the view into it, but certainly the view out of it would be terribly important. if a roadway was to go through that view shed, or a trail was to go through that view shed, it has the potential it certainly has the potential to adversely affect the setting of that property in a way that would diminish its historic value. And that's really what the criteria of adverse effect is. There's several examples given in the regulations: physical destruction or damage to all of the part of the property, alteration of the property, alteration to the setting of the property in such a way that it damages the historic characteristics of the property. There's a number of examples. Really what it comes down to is, does the property still retain its sufficient integrity to reflect its historic association and what makes it historic to begin with? And then the next point, the next stop in the 106 process is resolving adverse effects. And that normally involves a mitigation effort of some kind. I did put 4 mitigation examples of mitigation that we've done in the past that we do. One is of an archaeological excavation, which is the most common form of mitigation for an archaeological site. There's an example of a historic American building survey drawing of the facade of a building. That's a record of a historic building. There's another one called the Historic American Engineering Record, and there's an example in the upper right-hand corner of one of the piers of the Blountstown Truss Bridge over the Apalachicola River Bridge, which we did roughly 20 years ago. And then at the bottom center, we took the main span of the Lake Monroe Swing Bridge, which was a truss bridge, and we removed it from the bridge and installed it as a fishing pier on a county park that was alongside the original roadway ran when we placed that bridge. But once again, once you get to resolving adverse effects, you're in a memorandum of agreement or another appropriate agreement document depending on the circumstances. And that is not normally, you're not normally going to be able to do that as a type 1 CE. The best you would be able to get in most of those circumstances would be a type 2. I don't foresee a trail. The most likely kinds of impacts where you could have an adverse effect with a trail that would trigger some sort of memorandum of agreement would be the archaeological excavation one, in case the trail was going to damage an archaeological site. Now I want to get into real quickly, because once again, this is even more difficult. This part was even more difficult to make slides of, because this is some examples from the programmatic agreement we have with Federal Highways. I mean, with the Advisory Council and the SHPO. We have 3 stipulations that I want to draw your attention to in the 106 PA, because they break down project types as certain types of projects meeting certain conditions, which you have a somewhat more minor recording effort in order to document the finding to the State Historic Preservation Officer and the other consulting parties. They're a set. All of these stipulations, the first 2, 5, and 6 anyway, are the ones that scale back the level of effort and certainly the level of recording of the effort. You don't have a large cultural resources assessment survey to complete for these. You don't have to do as detailed a field work to get to them, but they're based on 2 things. They're based on the type of project, focusing, primarily on what activities are associated with that project. Because, for example, you could have a project that is simply placing a certain kind of paving on a recreational trail, and that could be the recreational trail project, and that is far likely to cause effects to historic properties than, say, if you had to clear and grub through a forest to install a recreational trail. So you can see some just for trails, there's a range of ways that you can increase or decrease the potential to have effects. 5 and 6 are the streamlined versions of compliance. As stipulation 7 just takes you back into the standard section 106 review. Stipulation 6, this is just an example. The less documentation that is required for compliance, and then it has a set of following conditions. It has to be a standalone project. When you look on the forms, and I have there's some images of the forms here, but you can't really read the form itself. You'll have to go to the chapter or to the programmatic agreement to actually read the forms. The lists of activities and then the lists of conditions. Obviously, if a project occurs on tribal lands, then it's out of the programmatic agreement because none of the tribes are signatories to the programmatic agreement. The activities that are listed for the Stipulation 6 projects, for example, here, there's many more projects listed in Stipulation 6 than there are in Stipulation 5. And frequently you can do most of these with a desktop and or a minor field review. And if you find there are no historic resources in the APE, then you can go forward with it. If there are historic resources in the APE, it may depend on whether or not those historic resources have been reviewed by SHPA before, what kind of historic resources they are, what kind of impacts they may be subject to. But since the significance determinations have to be made in consultation with the SHPA and the other consulting parties, neither FDOT nor or DEP can unilaterally make a decision that a historic resource is not significant. That's something that has to be done in consultation with the appropriate parties. And when you get to Stipulation 7, then you're just in the standard review and you go through the norm. And that can actually sometimes be just as short as one of the minor stipulations. But the minor stipulations we set up to be more formulaic so that we would be able to complete them more easily. And here's an example of the minor minimal impact potential determination form. Both the Stipulation 5 and the Stipulation 6 projects are included on this one form so that the decision can be made via using the one form, because a lot of times, like I said, the project is going to include many activities. Not all of those activities may be contained within Stipulation 5. The Stipulation 5 has a small list of activities that are exempted from a detailed review, and you can see them on here for Stipulation 5, which is at the top of the page. Installation of fencing, signs, pavement markings, small passenger shelters, etc. In-kind replacement of or ordinary repair of existing lighting, and so forth. There are only 6 activities that are really covered in Stipulation 5, and then there are the confirmed conditions that it's a standalone project. Now, by standalone, that doesn't mean it can only be one activity. You could have a project that is all 6 activities listed in 5, and if there are no other activities associated with the project and it meets the rest of these conditions, then it could still be processed as a Stipulation 5 project. And Exhibit 2 of the PA sets forth the activities, and number 57 on that list, I believe, is recreational trails. And recreational trails, as Tu mentioned earlier, are also exempted from Section 4F, but not importantly from Section 106, because Section 106 applies to all federal actions, not just USDOT actions, and 4F is specific to conversion of property into a transportation facility. I went a little fast there. This is a little bit more detail on the forms that I continue to show so I can illustrate the forms. And once again, you have to have the form is going to require a description and a justification of the APE. And it's very important to always include maps that show the location of the project, it's the vicinity of the project, and if there are historic resources near the project or just outside of the APE, it's nice to show those relationships, and also the vicinity resources can sometimes indicate whether or not there is a potential for the occurrence of resources inside the APE, and would be part of your normal review, even if you're doing just a desktop review of the tool using our EST tool. And there's this, and it gives you an opportunity to describe the methods you use in the survey. Then there's the signature, the verification signature, and the submission instructions. And note at the bottom of the form there is also a link to the 106 PA. But as I said, you can get to that at our website, and that might be easier to use when you're initiating a project. Is to go on to our website, either go to the chapter, which is Part 2, Chapter 8 again, or to go straight to the programmatic agreement, which is also linked on our website. And if neither of those forms will do, then there's the standard review for program undertakings, which, like I said, in some circumstances, say if you have a project that goes near tribal lands, for example, goes alongside tribal lands, you're not going to be able to use one of those forms, because those forms have never been concurred with by the tribes at this point in time. So you couldn't use it for consultation with the tribes, but you would be able to use it for consultation with the SHPOs, and you can use it in informing local governments and so forth, or other forms of consulting parties. The type of report you do, the Cultural Resource Assessment Survey, another source that you want to use to determine what to do for a survey and what a survey may involve, is Module 3 of the Guidelines for Use by Historic Preservation Professionals that are put out by the Department of State, the Florida Division of Historical Resources, and that can be found on their web page as well. In fact, you can just Google Module 3 and that title, and you would find it on the internet. The other documents that occurs, if there are historic resources present and you've determined that they're historic properties, you may still feel that there's no potential that your project will not affect them. And in that case, you would be putting together, or that you think it will affect them, and you're trying to determine if it's an adverse effect. You put together a Section 106 case report. Those are outlined in Module 3 as well, and they're in our Chapter 8 also, and they're also, some of that, a lot of that information is also in a Cultural Resources Management Handbook that can also be accessed from our webpage. And that's got the same submission instructions, because ultimately all this is to comply with 36 CFR Part 800, and 36 CFR Part 800's description of the information to provide is essentially the same for whatever kind of project you're doing. Sufficient information to document your decision and the justification for that decision of whatever your final decision is, whether it's no historic properties affected, no potential to affect historic properties, and no adverse effects to historic properties, any of those. This is the essential table of contents that is provided for by the Department of State for conducting a Cultural Resources Assessment Survey. And if you look down at the bottom, and this might be important for some of the Rec Trails programs, if the project is occurring on state lands, there is a 1A32 archaeological research permit that has to be obtained from the Bureau of Archaeological Resources, which is also underneath the Division of Historic Resources over at the Department of State. And then this is just a really nice reminder that Matt had made, that I decided I wanted to keep the text and the picture of. Was a determination. Just if you get a determination of adverse effects, and you're not going to be doing a Type 1 CE anymore. Say you wanted to build it. Say we were trying to build a trail and it had to go through this is going to be the most obvious example I can think of. It has to go through an Indian mound. That's not going to get a no adverse effect. I can kind of promise that. Now, my final notes on this is it's really important that you make sure that you have qualified professionals to conduct your cultural resources assessment surveys. And they can be found in 36 CFR, Part 61 and Appendix A of that. And they have the professional definitions for history, for historians, for archaeologists, and for architectural history. Most of them involve a master's degree or equivalent experience, and that's outlined in those. And throughout, it is important to keep in mind, especially if you have if you're creating a trail for substantial public use in a community that has some historic sensitivity. Perhaps you're creating a recreational trail to take advantage of the historical value of the community. You need to make sure the community is engaged in how you bring that trail through, where you want the markers, depending on the kinds of sensitivities. Say if you're in a historic district, the kinds of sensitivities that you may be dealing with, there may be locations where a trail would not be all that, locations through the district where a trail may not be all that much of an enhancement to the resource as the community may see it. So as I mentioned at the very get-go, we had a trail that was a design trail by a significant landscape designer, and we wanted to extend the trail and reconfigure it somewhat. And the SHPO felt that that would be an adverse effect, as did the locals. So that actually changed our project, and we eliminated that portion of the project where we extended and reconfigured the existing trail. And these are the resources that I'd mentioned. Once again, they'll be on the slides that are retained from this presentation. I've added in a bullet to the list that was there before, and that is, keep in mind that each FDOT district has a cultural resources coordinator. So if you're working on a recreational trail and it's being handled by one of the districts, there's a good chance you will be working with that cultural resources coordinator if it's in a historic area or if it involves historic properties, because that has to be a check. We have to make a Section 106 finding, and we have to carry it out in order to approve the project. And if you need to contact me at any time, and I'm always, and everybody who works with me can tell you this, I'm always open to any questions. So there's my contact information at the bottom. Thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to deal with them.
All right, thanks, Roy. We do have one question that has popped up. It's from Mira. The first question is, if there are no historic resources involved, do we still need to have public input and involvement beyond what is done during the application stage for the Rec Trails project?
If there are no historic resources involved, it's generally presumed that you've conducted a cultural resources assessment survey at some level, either a desktop one that identifies nothing of age, or a field visit which identifies no potential for the occurrence of archaeological sites. If we have a survey that confirms there's no historic properties involved or within the area of potential effect of the proposed project, then that's the end of the 106 process. If there's no resources at all, then that can be reported along with whatever research was completed to make that determination to the SHPO, the justification statements, and that's the end of the 106 process. If there are no historic resources present, then you can make that statement that there are no historic resources present. We've done the evaluation, and we're finished with the Section 106 process. But that would require a submittal to the SHPO, and the survey itself may involve talking to the locals that live there. And if it's in what is a sensitive archaeological area, to have looked at some of the information the tribes may have. But if there are no historic resources, nothing of 50 years of age or older there, and no potential for archaeological material, then that's reported to the SHPO, and the finding is no historic properties affected.
All right, thanks, Roy. We do have another question. If the site has no historic or cultural significance, what are the forms that need to be completed? And does a professional in this field still need to complete these forms?
Yes, if we identify historic resources in the area of potential effect, then we have to evaluate them in accordance with the National Register's criteria for eligibility. And so we have to explain that and why they don't meet that eligibility criteria. The forms that have to be filled out are the Florida site file forms, and that's a requirement that comes more from state law than it does from the federal law. And that is so that the State Historic Preservation Officer has the information they need to provide their opinion on historic significance. It would be the finding of, if it would be submitted by like if it was a recreational trail project and it was going to come through the FDOT, then it would be a finding that FDOT would have to provide to the SHPO, and the SHPO would need to concur with it. But the only forms are the Florida site file forms. If there's the stipulation 5 and 6 forms that are used when the project meets those criteria and is defined as one of those kinds of projects, which for this program is going to be primarily those stipulation 6 projects, numbered 57, I believe it was, which are recreational trails. Now keep in mind, and I think the two you had mentioned these in your presentation, is those in environmental alternatives, or those transportation alternatives projects. They do not necessarily equate to the same thing as the recreational trails program. Those are not just openly exempted from certain things that the recreational trails are exempted. But in both cases, you would be likely reporting these under the stipulation 6 type of projects, because you'll confirm visually and in background research that none of the historic properties are eligible. Say they've been too altered. They've had their main facades. They were originally colonial revival houses, and now they look like bungalows because of changes to the facade. Or probably the reverse would be more common. Somebody wanted their house to look like a colonial revival, so they got rid of the bungalow features in the front in the 1990s or something. But those are the forms. It's those two forms, that one form rather, that the minor or the minimal potential to impact form that it was created by the programmatic agreement, and then there are the Florida site file forms, which need to be completed for every historic property or every historic resource. Keep in mind that many of these historic resources may already have Florida site file forms, so that you may just be updating.
Okay, we do have a question from the City of Winter Springs currently has a rec trails project grant. I was not the original grant writer. Are these forms new to the grant process? And I'm not sure if this is referring to the forms that you just referred to or the type 1 CE form, but for the type 1 CE form, the type 1 CE has been available for quite some time, but with DEP now working with DOT, because we have NEPA assignment, the type 1 form is automated in that it is generated through the SWEPT tool that is managed by FDOT, so that form is new. But the forms that Roy is referring to, I think those forms have been in existence for a while. So Roy, I'll let you answer that part.
Yeah, they've been in existence from shortly after we completed the original programmatic agreement with the council and SHPO. They were 2 forms. There was a form for the more minor projects, and then a form for the less minor projects. The stipulation 5 projects had their own form, and the stipulation 6 projects had their own form. But then we realized logic dictated that the person would have to go through the provisions of the stipulation 5 material before they would arrive at doing it as a stipulation 6 project. So we combined the forms because everybody was doing both forms for most projects, because most projects were ending up as stipulation 6 projects. But those, you do not have to do those forms for these projects. The form, once again, if it has to be submitted to a tribe because there may be an archaeological site nearby or something like that, and we did some testing to confirm that the archaeological site did not reach into the project area, and we need to confirm that and need to get the tribe's opinion on that, then we would be sending that to the tribe, but we would not be sending it in one of those forms, at least not at this time. I am talking to the tribes right now a little bit about extending the ability to use those kinds of forms to the tribes. But right now you would have to use those forms if you wanted to report it to the SHPO that way. But keep in mind, those forms are simply a way to report, an easier way to report it. If we already have, and say it's not more than 10 years old or so, if we already have a concurrence from SHPO that there's no potential to affect historic properties, or there's no potential to, or the project is having no effect on historic properties or no adverse effect on historic properties, any of those findings, if we already have those, there's no necessity or requirement to go back and submit those back to SHPO in the forms. Those forms were made to simplify the coordination with the SHPO. But if you've done the coordination otherwise with the SHPO, simply because if you had to write a notification in a letter form or a letter report or a small technical memorandum to the tribes or to the district, some years ago, and it was submitted to SHPO, and you've got concurrences across the board, and nothing has changed in relation to historic properties on that project, that documentation is still fine.
Okay, and I think that leads us to another question. We had confirmed no historical impacts form July 2019. I'm thinking that's from July 2019. Will these confirmations be acceptable, or do we need current confirmation? And I think you just answered that question, Roy.
Yeah, and we use the term impact here kind of generally. The real findings we look for, at least in 106, and this is a terminology issue, and it's perhaps something I should have inserted at the beginning, is that we tend to talk when we're dealing with section 106, we tend to talk in terms of effects and adverse effects to historic properties, not so much impacts. Now, when you get into the rules that implement Chapter 267 of the Florida statutes, they use the word impacts a lot. But in the statute itself, in our state historic preservation statute, that is also written in terms of effects to historic properties. It's only when you get into the rule, and I think it's it's in our chapter. I think it's the Florida Administrative Code. It's sometimes hard for me to remember because there's several rules there's the rule that governs the permits for archaeological sites, but I think it's 1A42. I could be mistaken. And the 1A42 might very well be the requirement for an archaeological permit for research on state lands. But the rules are cited in the chapter as well. But there's a variety of rules that implement Chapter 267, and they tend to talk in terms of impacts. But impacts is a somewhat, unless we know what the impact is, we can make a determination on effects. But if they say if the DHR responded that there were no impacts, then I think it's safe to presume, that there are no effects.